Looking into colleges for my kids, we've discovered a number of excellent videos on YouTube by current students and recent grads on topics like my elite school, was it worth it? Or what's it like to be poor going to an Ivy League college? I'd like to add a few thoughts to the conversation. There are so many good questions that I'd really like to address about applying to college, but today let's join the conversation about whether it was worth it. What are the costs and the benefits of going to an Ivy League school? A number of the videos that I've found on YouTube that I really like are by people who've graduated within the past 5 years or so. They have a little bit of experience in the real world, and it gives them some solid perspective on what it was like to attend. I graduated from Cornell, class of 1990, and I'd like to share some of my thoughts now that we're over 30 years past my graduation date. And it's interesting how my life has been shaped by decisions I made when I was still a teenager. Welcome to the INRIS Files, thoughts on culture, history, and the human condition from a Generation X point of view. I'll note in the description section links to some of the videos that I found most interesting on this topic, but I'll be responding most closely to the topics raised by Asante the artist in her video, Was Harvard Worth It? The Hidden Costs of Attending an Ivy League College. Some of the hidden costs that she refers to did not apply to me. I did come from a lower middle class family, and I did attend a troubled and not very good public high school in the inner city. However, I'm not a person of color, and the difficulties that I found when I was at an Ivy League school did not arise from the way that I identified. Like Luke Skywalker at the cave on Dagobah, what you experience depends on what you carry with you. Your experience may be different from mine. Founded in 1885, Cornell University is the youngest of the Ivy League schools, and it was the only one that was created as a co-ed institution. It's made up of many colleges. I attended the College of Arts and Sciences, and during my time there, I had an opportunity to visit a lot of the other Ivies and other elite schools, and I wholeheartedly agree with Asante and others who've talked about the topic that the experience at the elite schools in the United States is probably, for the most part, very, very similar. When asking whether going to such a school is worth it, it makes sense to start with the costs, the financial costs. And toward that end, a lot of people automatically assume that Ivy League schools are outrageously expensive. The truth, however, is a little more nuanced than that. All of the Ivy League schools enjoy a very large funded endowment, which essentially means they've got a pile of cash reserves that are growing every year thanks to shrewd investments and also donations from alumni and corporations. As a result, they have the money in order to cover the tuition of their students. And the Ivy League system it's a sports league. They had decided long ago they were not going to offer scholarships on the basis of academic achievement or on the basis of sports achievement or extracurriculars. Their financial aid package was going to be based upon need. By the mid-1980s, when I had applied to colleges, they had evolved a very meticulous formula for determining how much a family could afford. And then if the family couldn't cover all of the costs associated with going to the college, they would support your application for government-based grants and loans, and then they would cover the rest with scholarship money from the university. As my father would often say in the years that followed, Cornell had done a very good job of figuring out to the penny exactly how much your family could afford, and then they would take every cent, and then they would stop. They didn't require you to take a second mortgage on your house. They didn't require you to sell the family car in order to be able to attend. I'll also note, I had been offered to admittance by more than one Ivy League school, and the initial financial aid package that I'd gotten was pretty much the same across the board, and I am inclined to believe that that is still probably true today. In the years since I attended, the Ivies have become a little more generous with poorer families. Most of them have a policy of any family making less than a certain dollar value per year will have their tuition and expenses covered in full. As usual, the wealthy, of course, can already afford to pay for everything. And as Asante and others have pointed out, it's usually the middle class that still gets squeezed. As my father was always amazed by the fact that Cornell was able to figure out exactly how much they could afford, and then they took every penny, their formula didn't really allow for much wiggle room. My father was laid off from his job during my sophomore year. I remember they called me and told me they wouldn't be able to make the next tuition payment because he had just been laid off. And I remember walking with a heavy heart to the financial aid office to talk with them about the situation. I was expecting I was going to have to take time off until my parents' financial situation improved. I told them about my father's unemployment. They asked that my father fill out a couple of forms documenting what was going on, which I did, and they told me to continue attending classes in the meantime, which I did. My father filled out those forms, sent them back, and then much to everybody's surprise, Cornell came back and said, "We are going to cover all of the rest of your expenses for the rest of this year, and we are not going to require you to let us know as soon as your father is back to work. We'll just pick it up again with the application for financial aid for next year." So that's what they did. By the time we applied again for financial aid for junior year, my father was employed, and Cornell resumed taking every penny that my parents could afford. 2 more points about the financial costs of attending Cornell University. I had learned fairly early on in my freshman year about a program called the Cornell Tradition. And what the Cornell Tradition did was it would essentially pay off your student loans as you accrued them, as long as you met 3 criteria. First was that you contributed to the Cornell community, which was a fancy way of saying that you participated in extracurricular activities. Second, that you maintained some kind of job in addition to your schoolwork. Since my financial aid package included work study, this was already something I was doing anyway. And then the third thing that the Cornell Tradition required was that you maintained a GPA level that was reasonable. The minimum was essentially just higher than making sure that you were passing all of your classes. As long as you were doing okay with your grades, as long as you had some sort of a job outside of your classwork, and as long as you were participating in extracurricular activities, then you would qualify for the program. You would have to apply every semester, and they would pay off your loans as you accrued them. As a result, by the time I graduated from Cornell, I graduated almost debt-free. I know that the program still exists. I do not know what it is called anymore. I know that they changed the name during the intervening years. I also don't know if it pays off the Parent Plus loans, which have long since replaced the very large student loans that they used to give as federally funded college support back when I was attending. I don't know those details now. I know that that is something that you would have to look up. But if you do end up attending any of the Ivies, they will all almost certainly have a program similar to this. I know that Cornell still has a program that is similar to this. Look into it. Ask around. You probably have friends who also have financial aid who might know about it as well. That's first. Finally, regarding financial costs, understand that attending a public school or a non-elite private school, the tuition bill usually is the bill, and there's not a lot of room for negotiation. I'll give as an example, my ex-wife also attended Cornell. Her family likewise had to pay everything that they could afford to Cornell for her to be able to attend. Her brother went to a well-known state school out of state, and the family had to go deep into debt to pay for his degree. Now, was his degree at Michigan worth more than her degree from Cornell? Well, either way, it was far more expensive. So that is something to understand as well. So yeah, you might think that the Ivies and other elite schools are more expensive, but at the end of the day, the bill might be much higher at a public or non-elite private institution. So yeah, those are some thoughts on the financial cost of going to Cornell, but what about the psychological costs? First up, we absolutely have to address, yes, it is competitive. It is very competitive. Maybe you were valedictorian or salutatorian at your high school. Congratulations. So was pretty much everybody else in your dorm floor. In fact, so was pretty much everybody else at Cornell. Not necessarily everybody, but it sure seems that way. And it's no great shakes that you kicked your SATs through the uprights, or that you got amazing teacher recommendations, or that you had a number of fantastic extracurriculars or sports experiences. So did most of your peers. Congratulations, you're good at math. The kid down the hall just wrote code that broke the federal government's encryption programs on their network. You were all high backstroke for the swim team. Congratulations. One of the other kids down the hall is on the U.S. Olympic decathlon team. Your peers are all go-getters, or so they seem to be, and it takes some getting used to. If you want to hold your own with them, you're going to have to step up your game. And either way, you're in for a healthy dose of imposter syndrome. That feeling that maybe you don't belong, that maybe they let you in as a mistake. Because when you walk into any given room, there's always someone there who's smarter than you. The competitive nature of going to Cornell could be compounded if you decided to pursue a course of study with classes that grade on a curve or require competition to get in. I was lucky. I tended not to pursue those classes. And actually, I chose a ridiculous path to determining which classes I would choose. I would stroll up and down the aisles of the bookstore and look at the reading list for the different classes, and the one that had the most interesting reading list, I signed up for that. A friend I had made during freshman orientation encouraged me to attend a lecture, and at that lecture found that the speaker was absolutely amazing, and he said that he was teaching a class to freshmen, so I signed up for his class. I'd been admitted by the math department, and I knew I would be transferring in a bunch of AP credits and other credits, so I knew I had room to take electives. So even though I was supposedly in the math department, my freshman year I was taking classes in American history, intro to psych, intro to sociology, Russian language, and Russian history. And that was the way it went. Turns out that there are much more interesting things to study in the classroom than math and computers. And I will note that now it's been well past 30 years since I graduated, and I'm working as a data analyst using computers and using math. But I had honed those skills as part of the work study that I had to do, the work study programs that I had to do. So my on-campus jobs, I learned math and computers, but I took classes in history and Russian and all these other topics. So the thing is, I had viewed my experience in college not as vocational training, but as an opportunity to learn anything that was interesting that I could get my hands on. This meant I wasn't competing against engineers for classes that graded on a curve. And I was never in danger of having my soul crushed by one of those weed-out classes that universities always deny that they have, but they absolutely do have. And I didn't suffer from imposter syndrome because I knew I was an imposter. I was a math nerd, and I was swimming in a sea of history majors, psychology majors, and economics and astronomy and theater majors. Anytime I walked into a classroom, I already knew I wasn't the smartest kid in the room because these kids had already studied far more than I had in these subjects. So I wasn't intimidated. I was in those rooms to learn from them, not compete with them. I completely lucked out, and I acknowledge that this was all luck based on how oblivious I was to understanding the college experience. Extracurriculars were also competitive, and here too I benefited from an accident of attitude more so than from anything else. In high school, I'd always gone out for extracurriculars as my interests led me, but at Cornell, there was often a process. Joining an a cappella group meant auditioning. Joining the daily student newspaper meant competting. A tedious competition and vetting process that felt more like rushing a fraternity which I also had no interest in joining. I tried getting involved with several extracurriculars, and in some cases I passed the audition, in some cases I didn't. If the nonsense I had to put up with had nothing to do with my ultimate goal for joining, I ditched it, and I looked for other opportunities. The student-run commercial radio station had a training program that was relevant to learning and developing skills necessary to get you on the air. Although I'd never heard the term at the time, they unofficially had what would today be called a no-cut policy. The daily newspaper had a compet program that taught you nothing about writing a successful newspaper column or news article and required jumping through hoops that were simply silly. I tried both organizations. I quickly chose the radio station. I knew others who had preferred going for the newspaper, and good for them. We all have different tastes, we all have different desires, we all have different talents, and we all have different things we're willing to put up with. I know that some of the people who survived the compet program at the Daily Sun seemed to feel that they were in some way superior to the kids at the radio station. I don't know anybody at the radio station who was bothered by this, nor anybody at the radio station who reciprocated. Several good reporters and authors came out of the Cornell Daily Sun. Several good reporters and authors came out of WVBR. I've noticed that some of the YouTube commentators on the Ivy League experience have expressed a certain level of frustration with the perceived pecking order among the extracurriculars. I have no doubt that for some people, that pecking order is a very real thing. But here again, my psychological costs were tied to other issues, and if some of the groups I joined were considered lightweight by those who consider themselves better than, I might have been aware of it, but I don't recall it fazing me at the time. Now, I know that other Ivies have final clubs and secret societies, and while Cornell did have a couple highly exclusive clubs like that, I never sought them out, and neither did they seek me out. I knew about them, and I didn't care. Perhaps if I had known how stupendously awesome they were, or how they might have opened doors that I never even knew existed, I might have spent more mental energy on all that. But I didn't, and I didn't. Likewise, perhaps if they had known how stupendously awesome I was, or how being associated with me would improve every aspect of their organization, they might have tried harder to get my attention, but they didn't, and they didn't. If exclusivity is your thing, there are plenty of opportunities to vie for exclusivity at an Ivy League school. Your mileage may vary. I'll also note that there were things I wanted to do that didn't have an existing club. The Student Assembly administered money culled from student activity fees, and students could apply for consideration to have this reserve fund their activities. The Student Union had small rooms available to set up office space. I applied on behalf of several projects. Some were funded, some were not. My point is, you didn't have to be stifled by the whims of an existing organization. You could just go out there and create your own. Now, I'm addressing these issues of competition and exclusivity because they have come up in some of the other videos I mentioned earlier. I'm going to skip for now the conversation about stress-related issues and the severely lacking mental health services at both elite and non-elite schools, which continue to this day. Those are very large topics best left for another time. And the issues plague both elite and non-elite schools with similar gravity. I'm also going to skip, for now, the topic of having no money when it appears that your friends have plenty to burn. Having spent a great deal of time discussing cost, though, what about the benefits of attending Cornell? Did I learn facts? Absolutely. Did I learn skills? Most definitely. Did I learn how to think critically, how to problem solve, and how to better evaluate and utilize information and resources available to me? You betcha. Did I goof off? Constantly. Was I constantly rubbing up against an inscrutable bureaucracy and mind-numbing administrative bull? All of the time. Okay, those last two aren't benefits. Sorry, truth be told, there were many things that annoyed me about Cornell that simply don't fit into the general ledger of, was it worth it? All of these statements, too, that I just made would be true whether I went to an Ivy League school or a trade school or community college, public university, military academy, or private liberal arts college. Even the most corrupt of for-profit online diploma mills will offer up some facts, some skills, and for the discerning student, some critical thinking. Now, if there are any distinct advantages to the elite institutions of higher education, they come down to access, opportunity, and community. The Cornell campus had so many opportunities whizzing by that you barely had a chance to grab one or two without missing a couple dozen because they were happening at the same time. I attended talks by the Librarian of Congress, the United States Poet Laureate, James the Amazing Randi, Carl Sagan, and more. I watched G. Gordon Liddy debate Abbie Hoffman. I interviewed several famous singers, politicians, and comedians who came to campus. I studied Russian language in Moscow as perestroika was undermining the very existence of the Soviet Union. And I saw the White Knights in St. Petersburg while that city was still being called Leningrad. I learned how to pull audio, cut tape, write copy, and assemble and deliver a newscast at a commercial radio station that was a member of the Associated Press and an affiliate of the NBC News Network. I sold a story to the AP while I was covering a local angle of the downing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland, and then was startled to read my words in the cover story of the Ithaca Journal just a couple of hours later. I worked at Cornell's particle accelerator. I learned HTML before the World Wide Web became a thing, and I learned how to fix a cassette player for the language lab just as that technology was being rendered obsolete. They can't all be wins, I guess. Because I was the voice of the marching band, I got to introduce them at halftime to a packed stadium at an NFL game in my hometown, and I got to hang out there in the press box with local and national broadcasters I'd watched and listened to since I was a kid. And I walked alongside the team at one point as they came in through their tunnel. They were tall. While I was still a student at Cornell, I was surprised to see a project that I had been involved in being criticized in a documentary on national TV. And while you might not think of that as a benefit of going to Cornell per se, it's emblematic of the reach that we had as members of that institution. I had unwittingly contributed to a national conversation. Oh, and because I lost a bet freshman year to a friend of mine, I ended up playing Carnegie Hall just a couple years later. True story. Then there's the community. Here's what happens when your peers are highly motivated, highly talented smarty pants. One of my trainees while I was training director at the radio station has since become a well-known television news anchor and reporter for NBC. Another is a famous Hollywood director. One friend became a high-ranking member of our nation's State Department, while another prosecuted a sitting congressman for the Department of Justice. Sure, we all know people from college who've gone on to become doctors or lawyers or best-selling authors or designers of the New York Times crossword puzzle. But how many of us can say the guy you see on QVC selling rugs was best man at our wedding? These were my friends, and even though it was unintentional, we all encouraged each other to demand more from ourselves because we wanted to live up to the potential that we saw in each other and that we saw in ourselves. And yes, after graduation, my Cornell connections did help open a door or two for me down the line. Now, none of the things I did at Cornell happened because I'm all that in a bag of chips. I'm not. Likewise, any one of the things I've listed here could have and has happened for many others at many non-elite schools. The difference between an Ivy and a non-elite school is that all of these opportunities form an abbreviated list of what I was able to take advantage of at Cornell. And this is just a tiny fraction of the many, many opportunities that were available to me. I let so many pass me by. So yeah, those I think comprise the list of benefits: access, opportunity, and community. As I alluded to earlier, a large part of what we experience depends upon what we bring with us as part of our physical, mental, emotional, and socioeconomic resources. We each have different advantages and disadvantages. I had a lot of friends at Cornell, relatively speaking, but I still often felt like an outsider. I may have skipped the imposter syndrome when it came to classes or extracurriculars, but in other regards, I felt insurmountable barriers between me and my peers, barriers that were simply part of my own weird personal makeup. There were times when I was convinced I would be better off transferring to another school. But wherever else I might have gone, I'd be taking me with me. Waging most of my personal battles was going to happen wherever I ended up calling my alma mater. As a result, I'm inclined to think at this late date that any psychological tolls I paid at Cornell, I likely would have paid in one way or another at any undergraduate school. The financial cost was arguably far higher for me and for my parents at Cornell than it would have been if I had gone to my hometown university. And arguably, the quality of education would probably have been roughly equal between a school like my hometown university and Cornell. However, for access, opportunities, and community that the Ivy League experience provided, I'm inclined to say yes, my time at Cornell was probably worth it. Well, that's my contribution to the conversation, at least so far. If you are an Ivy League or other elite school alum, was your experience worth it? If you're a current student, how's it going? Please be sure to be kind when you join the conversation in the comment section below. For those of you who might be applying to colleges or considering applying, I do hope you'll take away the following. First, don't apply to schools based on where you think you can afford to go. Start by applying to the schools you want to apply to, with a mix of schools considered to be easy to get into, reasonable to get into, and a few that might be considered a stretch. Then see what you can do about affording it. If you are smart enough and lucky enough to get into an Ivy League school, you and the school should be able to figure out a way for you to be able to afford attending. Second, the Ivies and other elite schools have far more applications from well-qualified candidates than they have spaces to admit them. If you apply to an Ivy and don't get in, that doesn't necessarily mean you're not qualified. It could simply mean that on that particular day of that particular admission cycle for that particular school, when they reviewed the list of 10 or 20 well-qualified candidates for one open slot, something about one of the other applications either popped just a little higher for one of the committee members, or it might simply have been a roll of the 20-sided die. Third, whether or not you choose to apply and whether or not you get into an Ivy League school, you owe it to yourself to make the best choice you can from among the schools that you do get into, and then I swear do everything you can to squeeze the best education and the most opportunities out of that school. Your attitude and your approach will have more to do with your experience than any other factors. Thank you for checking out the INRIS Files, and we'll see you again next time.